one of the original reasons why I was really keen on getting better at Chinese was reconnecting with my grandparents. And that has definitely been something that has happened, but I guess unfortunately not as much as I would have liked. So my last grandparent, so I call him my yeye. He's actually my waigong, my mother's father. He passed away April 2020. And I think that was a bit tough because I thought I would get to see him again, right? Especially after committing to this as my career path. But with COVID and stuff, there was just no way that we were able to go back to China.
請勿靠近車門，請不要靠近車門。Please stand back from the doors.
Welcome back, listeners, and welcome to What Kind of Asian Are You podcast. I am your host. My name is Kyle. And for those coming back for another episode, thank you so much for your continuing support. And for those that are new and this is your first time hearing this podcast is a podcast featuring conversations about being Asian. We look to highlight, amplify, and validate Asian voices worldwide. So in this podcast, you'll hear me talk to different diaspora Asians about their stories, their experiences, and just their wisdom for the most part. If you want to support this podcast, it's very easy. All you got to do is just keep listening. And also follow the Instagram at What Kind of Asian Pod and just connect with the podcast in any way you would like and share with your friends and family to those that you think will be positively impacted if they are aware of this podcast, and just spread the word out. If you can get this podcast to more ears and more followers and such, then I'll be able to bring in bigger guests or guests that you want me to interview next. And I really appreciate that, as I want to make this a bigger platform for those that do come and share their stories. And now on to today's guest. She is the founder, operator of this kind of venture, Panda Cub Stories, and her name is Linda. Hi, Linda. How are you doing today?
Hi, ni hao, and hello. I am doing very well. Thank you for having me, Kyle.
I think you were the first few. I was like, oh yeah, whenever you feel like it's a good time, we should talk on the podcast and go through your life and your story and stuff. And can you just let the audience know who you are, what you're about, and most importantly, what kind of Asian are you?
All right. So hi everyone. My name is Linda Yi. So I am Sichuanese American, Chinese American. So my Chinese name is actually exactly the same. So Yi Linda. I was actually named in English first, and then my parents picked the characters. So in terms of what kind of Asian am I? Acronym, I guess I would say I am Boba, right? Brought over by airplane, not quite ABC, but I was born in Chengdu, Sichuan, China. And when I was 4, my family immigrated to the US, and then I grew up in the US after that. And I guess in terms of what kind of Asian am I think I am one of those people who publicly rejected being Chinese for a long period in my adolescent and teenage and high school years, but would secretly still listen to Zhou Jielin and Wang Lihong and watch dramas. But I grew up in southern US, and there wasn't a ton of diversity, so all of those things I felt had to be consumed kind of in secret, not super intentionally, but I just didn't have people around me to share those interests with. So I actually couldn't read a lick of Chinese. Okay, maybe 1 2 3 4 5 不 上下, stuff like that, when I got to undergrad. And when I was in undergrad, that was really when I signed up for Mandarin classes and decided I was going to learn this language. Yeah, so that was more than 10 years ago, and in the decades since, I've been trying to learn and kind of grasp and master the language of my family.
That's great. And you mentioned something that is a new term for me. Boba, as in brought over by airplane. Is this a new term or something you made up?
So
Because
I
I never
haven't,
heard of that.
yeah, no, I heard it from one of my like online friends. Her name is Virginia Duan. So like before I'd been calling myself ABC-ish.
Yeah. Oh, and maybe I should use that term for myself too, because I think that's cute and also more appropriate for kind of how to describe yourself. Because sometimes if you're like in a situation where you immigrated to the West when you were like 4 or 5, in a sense, you are like really westernized to a certain extent, but at the same time, you're not exactly born in the
Yeah.
West. So that's, I think, very appropriate term. And in that kind of introduction of yourself, you kind of mentioned how you were really still immersed in, I guess, Asian media or Asian culture stuff, but then in a sense you were hiding it, not because you're ashamed or anything like that. It's just because maybe there aren't people around to share with you or anything like that. But
Mhm.
is there a bigger reason behind why you did? Why do you feel a need to be like, oh, I'm not gonna let people know, or I'm gonna do it on my own terms, kind of thing?
Yeah, so I think it's more a sense of it goes back to, lack of diversity and representation in media, right? And especially as you're growing up, when you enter middle school, when you're in high school, it's already a time when your sense of identity is being formed, but you're also very sensitive, right? About being wrong or being looked at as other. And so I think like at that time, I was not in a place where I was ready to be or even like knew I could be an advocate for my culture, right? So it was mostly what were the people around me, what were my friends interested in, and yeah, like what they were interested in was like watching the OC or Grey's Anatomy, and things that were popular culture. And so that's kind of what I went with. And yeah, at the time, like, I mean, my high school, there were probably 5 Chinese Americans besides myself in my grade, maybe not even my grade. Some of them were older than me. So there was not a very big culture or community. And yeah, and even like when we hung out, like we didn't, really talk about anything like Chinese related at all either. So I think it like for me, it was more I am very like addicted to narratives and stories. So that still very much had a hold on me, but I just never saw it as an option to experience something like this with someone else.
Oh, that's interesting. I think I sort of relate because I did kind of consume Asian media as well, but I wasn't really, I wasn't ashamed of it. It was just, I didn't talk about it. Just no one mentioned it, or I just
Yeah.
thought it's my little thing that I want to protect. But then now looking at the whole Asian representation in the West and all that stuff, I shouldn't be doing that. Well, I mean, people shouldn't be doing that. If you like it, you should like
Mhm.
appreciate it and just spread the word if you can. Like with the whole kind of, I'm kind of drifting away from the conversation, but like with the whole BTS stuff now and all that stuff. But like you also mentioned how you weren't able to really speak Chinese, or you were, but then in terms of reading or anything like that, you weren't really that in tune with it. Was it just because of like the fact that you were in Georgia where there's lack of like no actual like Chinese instruction schools in terms of like for diaspora, or your parents didn't really push it, or they were trying to make sure that your English was at a great level so that you weren't not struggling or anything like that?
Yeah, so my parents never like discouraged me from speaking. Like, actually, I think they were closer to the like speak Chinese at home, and I'd be like, no, and then I would answer in English. So I actually did go to Chinese school all throughout elementary school because before moving to Georgia, I was in Maryland, Ellicott City, where there was a very large Chinese American population. So I think I probably got up to like if I was to guess, maybe 500 to 800 Chinese characters by the time I graduated elementary school. But in middle school, we moved to Georgia and not Atlanta, so another part of Georgia. And at the time, I don't believe there was any Chinese school. There is now. So there is a small Chinese school that I think is run out of a local church, but that was not present when I was there. And I think like part of it was also I moved in middle school, and I started doing a lot of extracurriculars that would take the weekend spots. And I think because the instruction wasn't immediately available and all of these other activities were kind of like taking the place, right, of what Chinese school would have been, my parents didn't push it very much. And yeah, I very quickly regressed. And I think part of it was like in maybe first or second grade, I took Chinese school seriously. And then around third grade, like we all sat in the back trading Pokemon cards and like, and it was like never something I had like really locked in. And yeah, I didn't realize how bad my Chinese was until after high school. I went back to Sichuan to spend like some time with my extended family, and I couldn't read anything. Like even my speaking was very stilted. Like I thought I could speak, but it turns out like I was very comfortable listening. But then when I tried to string complete sentences together, like often it would come out jumbled, or I would stop because I was actually like saying something the way I would say in English. So it took a bit of a adjustment, and it was a wake up call.
Wow. And I'm interested in how your parents, I'm sure they decided, oh, those extracurricular things were needed for you so that you could develop more well-rounded and like just get a foot ahead in terms of like post-secondary and all that stuff. But then for them to be like, oh yeah, those takes precedent and like Chinese school isn't as important. Do you feel like that's just no, they're just, oh, we want to make sure you succeed, or it was just they didn't find that your Chinese was that bad, or they didn't think it
Yeah.
was that big of a deal?
So I think part of it is like there wasn't Chinese school at the time. So either, like they would teach me themselves, which I'm trying to think if that happened. Yeah, I don't think like they attempted to teach me themselves. I think had there been Chinese school, they would have signed me up for it and made me go. But because it wasn't offered in the community, and both my mom and my dad, like my mom had gotten a job down in Georgia, which is why we moved. And my dad was in the process of setting up his own acupuncture clinic, which was very stressful for like the initial couple of years. So I think like they were also focused on that. And yeah, and I mean, like I was always like a very dedicated student, and in terms of weekends, like that would be cheerleading practice, and I practiced piano, like, and I competed, so like a lot of that. Yeah, so I think it was more a factor of lack of access, plus there were like it's not like I was sitting at home playing video games, because my parents would not buy me a game console, right? So yeah, so it's like not that my time wasn't filled up with other endeavors. So I mostly chalk it up to that.
And continue with like your journey with this kind of learning of your language, your kind of cultural, I guess, no, understanding more of it. I guess it all really came to like a peak when you went back to China, to where your family is from originally, and you
Mhm.
realize, oh, there's a disconnect of how much you feel like you know versus what you actually do know or able to converse in. So is that why in college you made it a point to like take those kind of language classes so that you could be back to the level that you want or thinking that you should be at?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely like a clear spark point. Because like I think I still thought my Chinese was good, right? I can't really read, but I can like I'm fluent. And I think that summer, like, gosh, when did I'm not sure if it was like the third Lord of the Ring had just come out, or maybe like my family was watching the DVD, and I was trying to like talk to my older cousin at the time about this movie, and I was like, oh, like the 电影 with a 圆圈在这个上面, and I was like not only did I not know how to say ring, I forgot how to say finger, and it was just like, it was very frustrating, especially since I think my sense of self in general was, I, like, while sort of shy, am a pretty well-spoken person, and I can get, what I'm thinking across like very compellingly in English. And I think like being faced with the fact that I was not only not compelling, I was like sometimes incomprehensible in Chinese. I was like, that's just not good. But I think like another thing was that summer, I had a lot of fun in China. Like I hadn't been back in years. And I actually, one of my aunts had set me up with this Chinese tutor who, she did teach very traditionally, and it wasn't always very fun, but she had started our sessions off with teaching me about like the four major types of Chinese characters, right? Like pictograms, ideograms, and then the biggest category, which is like xingshens, so like half sound, half meaning. And I think like no one had really, or if I had learned this in Chinese school, I forgot it, but like no one had really like explained that to me. And so one of the biggest things that I found frustrating about Chinese characters is like they all look so similar, and like how the heck do you even like, why would anyone design a language like this? And then it turns out that yeah, they look similar because this one component gives you a sound hint. So like every time you see like qing, right, in a character, like it's probably going to sound similar to like qing, 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 qing. So I think like it was like, on one hand, it was the negative reinforcement, right? Being like embarrassed and frustrated of not being able to communicate on the level that I wanted to. And then on another hand, it was like the positive curiosity of like realizing, oh, there are like depths to this language that I didn't know. So that's why I first signed up. And I would say also, so I went to Duke University, it's in North Carolina, and there were a lot more Asian Americans and also Chinese Americans there. And I think like, some of them were like me, could speak, but really grew up, I don't know, like I no longer really like using, Twinkie or banana, but like, but there were also a lot of other Chinese Americans who were really in touch, right, with their culture and language. So I thought that I felt that very kind of liberating in a way, and definitely encouraging.
Oh, that's great. And it's nice to hear like how specific Asian American, Chinese American kind of reconnected with like just not just their language, but just their identity in terms of like what makes them like feel liberated and all that stuff. So you mentioned you study at Duke. What did you study initially in terms of um you know your major and all that stuff? Because we gotta talk about like your art business and stuff, and I feel like it could be related, but not really because it's so different. But like what did you study and like how was your experience like?
So initially, it was a political science major, and I did comparative politics, US and China. All throughout college, I think I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And I think like, I mean, the reason also I chose my poli-sci major was my father really, really wanted me to be a doctor. I knew I didn't want to be a doctor, but, like, and it's the old story, like the other options are like lawyer, engineer, right? And and I was like, okay, well, out of all of those things, I like using language the best. So law or something that could conceivably be like turned into pre-law would probably be my best bet. But I think like the things that were consistent about my college experience and what I liked was I did want to be at the intersection of the US and China. And I think a lot of that is also, this deep-seated desire to explore the intersectionalities, right, of my own identity. My summer after freshman year, I had actually studied abroad in Beijing with my school, but for my course, it was a work study, or not work study. It was more like a service study program. So I had to go research a Chinese nonprofit to volunteer with or intern with while I was there, to kind of like have some practical use of my Mandarin. And so I actually ended up working with a nonprofit at the time called Huadan that did community theater and kind of migrant children's education. And I really fell in love with teaching. So, and I also art has been a love of mine for like a very, very long time, since I was like as early as I can remember picking up a crayon and drawing. And so I think like those three things, like being interested in China, really like working with children and teaching, and also wanting to do art in some form, were things that I kept trying to incorporate, but didn't quite, I think, like 100% achieve, like complete satisfaction with. So the art major was kind of when I realized that, like, so I had gone to France to study for a year, and kind of being there and being around all the other art students and fine artists, like I was really inspired. And also it was like one of the first times that I had seen anybody my age taking their art seriously as a primary calling, because at Duke, Duke is not an art school, and our art program was very, very small at the time. It's larger now, but I think more on the media art side. And my focus was fine art and illustration. And so I think like after after France, I was like, well, like if I'm not serious about my art, like how can I expect to accomplish anything? So I switched to an art major, but I was still like taking Chinese, and I like continued to volunteer and work with kids. So yeah, so when I graduated, I officially had the art degree, but I did not know what I wanted to do. And I actually ended up getting a 1-year fellowship to go work in China with the same nonprofit. So I was more of a community researcher and organizer, and kind of a jack of all trades with a nonprofit, because I could also speak English and write like English grant proposals. But while I was there, it was like my first taste in working full time with a group of people who were simultaneously trying to practice their art, which took the form of theater, but also apply that to their community for positive change. So I think like the seeds of what I'm doing now were very much planted back in undergrad. I just didn't know it at the time. It felt very Mimang, like I felt very lost. But looking back, I'm like, okay, I can see how like that path led to now.
That's great. And wow, that's what a journey. And it's interesting to see how it all unfolded into now. It seems like whatever you did in your undergrad is definitely what I could see like makes perfect sense of what you're doing now. And you mentioned like, oh, you spent time like during your undergrad and after graduation in China. Can you just talk about that experience? Not technically like your kind of work experience, but just living there after so many years removed from it, where you grew up in the States and now you're back to the motherland, where like things will probably have been way different when you were there, because China just blew up when you were gone essentially, and even more. So can you just talk about your experience there? Do you feel like you didn't fit in, or any kind of those kind of feelings?
No, not at all. Like I actually joke that I had more culture shock moving down south when I was a middle schooler than I did when I moved to China for work right after graduation. And I think part of that is also um, the organization I worked with, Huadan. Like, we were a very close knit group. So at the time, I was the only quote unquote foreigner. Like, occasionally they would have, like someone on staff, like from France or from the UK. But at the time, I was the only American, and everybody else was from China, but from very different backgrounds. So like our creative director at the time, and I'm still talking about work, but I think like this is relevant. She was like born and raised Beijinger, very sunny. Her name also happened to be Yang, so very apt. Like very bilingual and very welcoming. And the other women, like the same. So we would cook together, right? Like at lunch, in the middle of the workday, and two of them were former migrant workers. So like part of their experience is also finding acceptance in the city, right? Like, whereas usually they're very discriminated against. So I think like having that little bubble was really helpful in letting me settle like comfortably right into Beijing. But at the same time, I think like so I loved living in Beijing. Is still one of my favorite cities apart from the pollution. And I think I spent a good time with my Chinese colleagues as well as my expat friends, all of whom were very interested in China. And I think like that's the difference between like, as far as I can tell, right, the young expat communities in Shanghai versus Beijing. Like in Beijing, like almost everyone I met was fluent in Chinese, or at least like taking classes, interested in the Chinese language. And a lot of them were like, journalists or people like interested in politics. So very aware of what was happening in China and like down to talk about it. So
That's great. And I'm happy to hear like your experience was a good one. And after your fellowship in Beijing and this career aspect, what were you feeling? Or because I know that you then, eventually got a master's as well at Cambridge. So can you just talk about like how come you didn't continue just working, or what was the plan with like taking that master's?
yeah, so the master's actually didn't come until 5 years later. So I worked for 5 years between undergrad and grad school. And those 5 years were split between, so for about a year, I worked on this startup that like no longer exists anymore. Like our website isn't up. It's like it was here and then gone like a, like a mirage. So it's called Bottle Rocket, but I was a co-founder with my friend Jude at the time, who I'd met in Beijing. And so we actually wanted to create a social media platform where other young people, not necessarily like Asians. Well, I mean, he also wasn't Asian. He was from like the Midwest. But like where young people pursuing rather untraditional paths could meet up and, either like meet up as co-founders, but not necessarily like just for networking, but to share life experiences and encourage each other, right? Like on our non-traditional life paths, very similar to what you are doing, right, with your podcast. And so we worked on our startup for about a year, had, like started creating the platform, like started like looking for funding. But, honestly, like we both were not prepared at the time to do the type of company that we said we wanted to do, because like we were like, oh, it's going to be a tech company, but neither of us had technical expertise, and the developers that we hired like were just not a good fit. And so I think like that was my first foray into business, which was a complete failure. And I had to, well, I didn't have to. I'm very happy that my parents are Asian, and I was moving back home was always an option, but it was definitely not fun, right? And then I got a lot of like, like, what are you doing? You're wasting time. Like we didn't send you to Duke for nothing. And so after that, I actually took a job at Duke University, so my alma mater, because one of my old professors had recommended me to my supervisor at the time, because the department that I was in, it was called Duke TIP, Duke Talent Identification Program. So they were piloting a program in China for the first time, and they were looking for us like kind of a program coordinator for that. So I interviewed and I was brought on board. And that first job was actually, so I was actually like choosing between like this preschool job where I would be teaching in a like Mandarin immersion Montessori preschool in Boston, where I'd been student teaching for a while, versus, and like that hit a lot of the things that I wanted, right? Like I was working on a daily basis with children. I was speaking Chinese. I was like making little picture books and telling them stories. And it was very, very fulfilling. The only thing that was not fulfilling was the salary, which is very low. And so I actually was looking at this other job at Duke, and I was like, well, there's no direct, like interaction with children, and I'm not exactly teaching, but I would be working hard to make an educational program happen. And part of that job was also, I would be working with a lot of Chinese coworkers. So I would liaise, right, with Duke Quinsheng University, which is where we were hosting the program. And I would travel to China 3 times a year. On business trips for both like recruiting and also direct program administration. And so I ended up taking the job with Duke because, yeah, I mean, it was like 3 times as much as what I would have made. Unfortunately, like preschool teachers are just teachers in general. Let me just like put a little plug in, like we need to pay our teachers more in the US. But I'm actually very, very grateful that I took that job, because though it wasn't 100% what I wanted, it taught me a lot more about seeing large scale projects through. Towards the end of my tenure there, I did like have to manage a staff of 25 in the summer. So I had to like kind of break out of my shell so that I could support, right, the people who came to me for support. And yeah, and I had a really great experience with my coworkers. So I kind of like had a better sense of next time I'm in a leadership position, for example, like how are the ways that I want to run and support my team. But and this was like around 2017, and I was 27 at the time, and I kind of like had a moment where I was like, well, like, is this what I want to do for the rest of my life? I could see a pretty clear career progression, like especially if you're in higher ed administration, right? Like, all the classes of like assistant director, right? Like executive level director. And I was like, to be honest, I don't want my boss's job, right? Like next year or in 10 years, like that's not what I aspired to. And I was like, if I'm going to try and make it as, I don't think I admitted to myself at the time that I wanted to be an artist, but I was like, if, I want to continue to work with children and, create something that is mine and a story of mine that is told that could help other people, then yeah, like there's not going to be a better time, right? Like I already felt like it was a little too late to start, but I was like, I don't have a mortgage. Like I was dating someone, but I wasn't married and I didn't have kids. And I was like, there's no like best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. Second best time is now. So I ended up applying to grad school, and I chose the program in critical approaches to children's literature at Cambridge. So I got in and I moved there for a year.
That's amazing. And for you to be like willing to take that leap of faith, to be like, oh, I'm gonna go do grad school to learn more about what you really want to do and just go for it. That's really admirable. Even though you, like you said, you don't have a mortgage or anything like that, but it's still a great undertaking because like you said, like your career path was very like set out already. You knew the what you can get or like how you'll end up because it's very apparent. But to take on like the whole grad school and now after grad school, you might not even know what is ahead for you. Like you might not be end up doing what you wanted to do because things change and all that stuff. But with doing that, do you feel like that kind of lead up to where we are now, where you're doing what you do? Can you just talk about what exactly are you doing now? Like we mentioned you're an artist, but specifically what are you kind of like doing with like the artist tag? Like what do you create and like what's your mission, what's your goal, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so I think going to grad school was definitely like the second catalyst point in my career. But in terms of what I wanted to do, so I say artist, but actually, like, I remember when my startup failed and I was trying to figure out like what I wanted to do, I had like written all of these sticky notes of like potential career paths, but like the three biggest ones were writer, artist, and teacher. And I was like, I don't know, like I have to figure out what to choose. And so kind of to fast forward now, I do feel like I am a blend of all three of those. So I'm a visual artist, but I also write and create content, but all of those things also kind of circle back to a pedagogical goal. So like to teach Chinese literacy and now also like Sichuanese food, which I'll talk about later. So I think for grad school, I was pretty set on the idea that I wanted to be a children's literature author, but I wasn't quite sure what genre. So like, I'd done podcasts, I like done little short picture book illustration mock-ups, and I had also written a novella length novel that was like more YA. So the program I chose because I wanted to study more like deeply and explore more deeply into the world of children literature to kind of see like what else was out there and if that could actually inform my own like creative process. I will say that I actually like so I wouldn't say I chickened out anymore. I used to, but I was basically like, I was like, should I get an MFA, Master's of Fine Arts, or this other program is a Master's of Education, but it like researches children's literature. And I chose the safer option, right? I was like, MFA is kind of risky, which I still agree. Like it's a gamble. And so for the Cambridge program, it's like one of the oldest and most established in the field. And I'm very glad I did it. But I think it also taught me that I did not want to stay right in academia researching children's literature because I think like a lot of my professors kind of made the choice of do I want to create or do I want to be a scholar of this discipline? And they chose scholarship, and that leaves often very little room for creating things yourself. It can be done. There was one younger professor who like was doing both, but I was like, I'm clearly not passionate about one of these things. And I think like that's one of those things that you have to be very careful about because I did well in my program. So my thesis got best dissertation in my track, which like I'm very proud of. And it was also kind of a non-conventional thesis. So I actually co-wrote a book with a 9-year-old boy who was also Chinese, or I was like, who's also Chinese American, who's not American, who was Chinese British. And we were actually like creating drawings and exploring Chinese characters through art. And I documented the process of co-authorship with a child, which was the title of my thesis. And so I think I came out of the program I think like one, a little confused still about what I wanted to do, because I was like, well, I narrowed it down to like, I don't want to do academic research in children's literature. Um, but I still don't know specifically like what genre I want to do. So the year after grad school was actually a year of trying everything, like throwing mud on the wall to see if it sticks. And it was at the same time very stressful, but very necessary. So I think like that's probably the year where I felt most confused and most like a failure, because I was doing all of these things, but getting very little feedback. And at the time, it's like none of my friends, like my partner was a teacher, a lot of my friends, like, were in tech. Or like, like worked other jobs, but none of them were in the creative industry. So I think I was kind of just like creating by myself in my apartment and then posting it to social media and often getting crickets, right? And I think like it's already very hard to separate yourself from social media metrics, especially if your business or your project lives right in the social media realm. But I think like when the only feedback you're getting is honestly like reactions you can't control from complete strangers, that's quite a dangerous thing. And so I burnt out a little, and this was like in 2018. And I was like, okay, like what what am I going to do? And I was still teaching part-time at a preschool in Durham at the time. And so my ex-boyfriend at the time had gotten a job in New York, and I was like, well, okay, like I'm gonna move and I'm gonna figure things out from there. And it had actually like timed out pretty well, because so I guess I'll give you like a laundry list of things I did that year. So I did like a full like 23 episode podcast that was bilingual English and Mandarin about this like Chinese mermaid story that I had written. I'd done like semi-animated YouTube videos. And I was also doing like these 100 character watercolor paintings. So all of those had like some element of Chinese culture, Chinese language, and narrative in it. But none of them were getting, outward success. And but like actually a woman who and I had also taken on a audiobook voiceover recording project from a woman who had self-authored a children's book. So I did like the bilingual recording for her. And funnily enough, one of the mothers who was in her like Facebook like Mandarin immersion group like found Panda Cub Stories through this woman's like audiobook, and actually contacted me and offered me a position with her company, which is called Little Chinese Learners. And so it was completely remote, and she was like, you can, control how many hours you work. It's a very decent rate. And it sort of like shifted. So it was, I started out doing curriculum research, and then I started like writing on the curriculum team. And then I also started to do animation kind of like design work. And now I like also do voiceovers for them. And so that opportunity came at the same time when we were deciding whether or not to move to New York. And I was like, okay, well, this seems like a good dovetail, right? Because I can move there and still work this job. Yeah, and when I moved to New York is actually when I started the Panda Cub Stories like web comic, because before it like had gone through a lot of different lives. And the web comic is the first thing that really took off. And it was actually funny because it was supposed to be somewhat of a side project. So I was still working on my children's literature portfolio, and I was going to be submitting to agents and trying to get published, like in the traditional manner. But I was also kind of like doodling these little comics to help myself kind of remember the Chinese that I had learned from before, because I felt myself forgetting a lot of it, because after I moved to New York, I was no longer using really Chinese in my daily life, because I wasn't teaching in the school anymore. And yeah, and like I think being able to freelance and work for a company that focuses on teaching Chinese to little children, which is what I was trying to force like my art to do previously, um, kind of like freed me to just play a little bit and figure out what felt good and what felt right to me at the time. So long story short, it's not a short story, it's a very long story, but um, that's kind of how the Panda Cub Stories webcomic started. And what I do now is two main things. So Panda Cub Stories is now a company I incorporated, and it has basically like two legs. So one is the one that you, Kyle, are already aware of. So I basically teach Chinese characters one comic at a time. And so the idea is to both create like really engaging and kind of dorky and funny stories that help you remember a character, but like not just rote memorization. So like explaining and revealing the breakdown of how these characters are constructed, which is actually like really super fucking cool. Sorry, really cool. And yeah, and so I like do about 10 of these character comics, and then I write a longer story using the Chinese that we've learned previously. And so the idea is I will probably be drawing these for the rest of my life, but the story reviews will become more and more complicated. So like, for example, in this first year, I'll probably like teach you through like a kindergarten reading level. And then in the next couple of years, it'll level up as I'm doing more comics and more readers. And then the other aspect is actually I'm doing under Panda Cub Stories, this thing called Panda Cub Diner, because like I decided I wanted to teach myself or like kind of consolidate my knowledge in terms of how to make Sichuan food. And a number of my readers expressed interest in it. So I actually ended up creating an e-course that teaches like very simple and quick Sichuanese meals. So 15 people signed up for that, and I'm finishing the pilot now. So I'll probably launch that next month. So yeah, I guess I would kind of classify Panda Cub Stories as, I don't know, almost like a small media company with the audience of mainly me, but then also like people tend to like it as well. So I also share it with other people. Yeah, so I guess that's how I make most of my business decisions. Like, am I going to read this or use this? And then I'll make it.
I think that's the perfect way, because I think you should be producing stuff that you want to consume yourself. And it seems like a lot of your kind of creative pursuit and your like kind of business moves are based around like, I don't want to lose my language, or I want to learn something that really means a lot to you. And I think that will help you from burning out less, or just, not be impacted by, say, oh, negativity revolving around the business. Of course, it will affect you, but it won't be as bad because you're so passionate about what you're doing. It's for you more than like obviously for your audience or for like monetary gain. Because at the end of the day, I feel like, say you're not doing this business and like you have another job, but you're still going to be actively trying to like improve your Chinese, or like consolidate like Chengdu cooking and stuff. So I think this is a perfect thing for you to do. And you like mentioned like the whole 100 characters kind of water painting. That's how I found you, and I was impressed. Like at first, I just thought, oh, it's this art project, but I didn't realize like you had a bigger kind of plan of like, oh, using it to teach and like to be where like you create comics. Yeah. So with all that being said, how is it how does it feel to be working on like an art project, business kind of thing, revolving around your culture, your language, your identity, that, normally you would think, oh, these kind of stuff, you can't expect to make money or like make a living out of it, because to be honest, like the traditional way of making money with your culture would be like, oh, actually just teaching it straight, like
Mhm.
a normal classroom setting, which you could do obviously, but you're
Yep.
taking the
And
more
I did
creative
do
route.
for a
Yeah.
number of
Mhm.
years part-time. Yeah. Yeah, to be honest, it's been a mix of very stressful and very rewarding. And I would say in terms of business, it's only been in the last half a year that I think like my business has really grown. So just for context, like I was making like $200 a month on Patreon for like a number of months. And then this past month in July was the first month I've been able to like cover my New York City rent solely with income from Panda Cub Stories. So that was a big deal for me. It's still like nothing to shout from the rooftops. I had about like 1,300 plus Patreon, maybe around 1,400 in income from Panda. And but I think like that was very heartening to me, because just like for the longest time I could like, similar to what you said, I was like, I'm really passionate about this and like I want to make it happen, but I don't know how. And my like kind of in my mind, the only way for financial guarantee was if I was able to sell my idea as a book concept, right? Which is already very hard if you're not an established author. And and honestly, like one of the reasons why I was working really hard on Instagram too was one of the agents, literary agents that I had talked to was like, if you're an unknown author, like you can take your chances, but the chances will be improved if you can prove, right, that you have a receptive audience to your work. And so I think like there was that. And in a lot of ways, I'm also quite traditional. So like it's very important to me that at some point in my career, I get to the point where I can support my parents. And they actually both retired last year already. And they're very financially responsible, like they're fine. But like, especially when they get older, like I don't want to be in a position where like they can't count on me, right, to support them. And I do want a family later on. So I think like there are all of these thoughts that compete, right, with the desire to both do what I want to do as a benefit to myself as well as my community. But also like how do you monetize it, right? And how do you feed yourself? And I would say, honestly, like the Panda Cub Diner idea was the result of me like having all of these questions, because for Panda Cub Stories and the comics, they're definitely like a cross between education and storytelling and art. But like at the core of it, it's still, I want it to be good, right? Like narratively, I don't want to just like randomly draw like anything and like be disrespectful to my readers as well as myself. Like I want it to be a solid narrative and I want it to be funny. And I think like sometimes attaching a dollar sign to that and like really going at that project full bore as a businesswoman as well as a creator, those two things clash a lot. And I was having a lot of trouble reconciling those things. So for the Panda Cub Diner, it was actually, I had signed up for this group business coaching program called Momentum. And through that, like I sort of like offhand mentioned that I was trying to, like cook more Sichuan food. And one of the women, she was like the coach, she's also Chinese American. She's like, oh, like I would love to learn your family's recipe for like chili oil. And so that was something that kind of like sparked the initial idea for the e-course, because like being in the online space, I had also seen just like online courses for different things. And there are some really aggressive like marketers who are like, take my class, I'm making an online course. And I was like, no. But then I was like, well, okay, so a cooking class that also functions kind of as a culture class is something I can do. And it doesn't need to be like super complicated. Like my goal was to create something simple that like I, as a very lazy cook, could follow and kind of put it out there. And so I'm actually very excited about that product, which feels more like a product. And I think being able to separate that mentally has been really helpful. So now, like, I'm still working very hard on the comics, but it feels more like play again. And on the other side of, I guess, like the river, I'm also working very hard on like creating this online course, which I'm almost done with. And that's where most of my income came from last month. So I had the 15 beta students pay like $88 each for like the not yet created version of the course, and we created it together with their feedback. Yeah, so I think like in terms of being an art entrepreneur, that's the way, at least now, I found like the healthiest in terms of trying to be true to my art, but also, like, yeah, I don't want to be a starving artist. And yeah, so.
That's amazing. And yeah, when you're talking about the whole kind of concept, like how do you make your art still art, but then you start to think of the business side? Because I'm not saying like I want to make, well, I do want to hopefully eventually get this podcast to where it could be monetized and stuff. But I'm thinking like with like what I try set out to do, which is just tell stories and all that stuff. How do I make it in a sense where it's still that, but also I can incorporate some monetary kind of compensation and stuff, but it means I need to get sponsors or whatever. But does that correlate with the ethos of the podcast? Like, am I gonna just let sponsors come in, any kind of sponsor where it might go against like the stories that I want to tell and all that stuff? So it's hard to find a balance, and I'm so happy you're able to find that balance and able to create a whole different product that still aligns with what you hope to do with your overall kind of company, with like the art and the storytelling and the creativity aspect. And I'm very excited to see how it'll go for you with that kind of project. I'm sure it'll be really successful because I think the whole food and teaching kind of online landscape is still very profitable, or just no, it's for people to still go in and see what they can do. And I want to just backtrack to just your kind of specific comics and stuff. Like with your comics, the big thing is like it's really nicely done. You learn a lot, and it's very cute because of the fact of the character you decide to utilize. So I just want to ask you, why Panda specifically, and along with the other characters that you involve into the comics? Like, can you just go through like what characters are in your comics and your reasoning behind it, and like what else are you trying to do with the comics is like the bigger goal at the end of the day? I understand you want to like build each level up, which is I think is a really nice goal to go towards, but like what's the ultimate goal?
Yeah, so I think the ultimate goal is to have the parallel priorities of like effective language teaching along with storytelling. And the storytelling, I think, will kind of be guided by my own narrative. Yeah, it started out as a picture book concept. So it was, I don't know if you can see, yeah, so it was a picture book that I was drafting for a very young age. So like around 3 to 5 year old kind of like audience, where it basically follows this like magical panda cub who wakes up like in an airport shop and like is picked up by a little girl who is immigrating to the US from, I don't know, maybe Chengdu. Like, and the idea is like the panda cub and she would go on like these adventures similar to, I don't know if you ever watched Wishbone growing up, but kind of like exploring either like her Chinese identity, culture, or other stories like within the framework of Panda Cub Stories. So that was the original idea. And when I kind of like really burnt out and put the children's literature portfolio to the side for a bit, like I still wanted to be creating. So I went with a much simpler style that I mostly like used in my own journals and like letters to friends, and started doodling those. So for the panda, like that's why it's a panda. And also like I'm from Chengdu, so that's like home of the giant panda. And I have a very strong connection with it. And the little hedgehog, honestly, like sort of came from, there was like one, I don't even remember which one it was, but it was a comic where I wanted the panda to banter with someone that was not me. And I was like, who should it be? And at the time, I had a little hedgehog. Her name was Henrietta, as a pet. So I sort of like brought her into the comic. And yeah, in the beginning, like me, Panda, Hedgehog had all of the same personalities, like they were not separate at all. Now they're starting to differentiate a little bit. So I'm very much kind of like the narrator, often behind the scenes. The panda is very exuberant, very excited, very like ADHD, whereas the hedgehog is a little bit more anxious, and a little bit more kind of like cautious. And those things are all elements that like are part of my personality as well. So in a way, like I haven't quite decided if the panda and hedgehog are completely separate from me, or if they are like manifestations of my own psyche. And I figure like I'll figure that out as the comic progresses. As far as the other characters, they're just like animals and people in my life. So my two cats, my ex-boyfriend was in it for a while. And yeah, and like actually a side note, like part of what I was doing with the comic was like it was also a vehicle for me to share my culture with him, because he's American, he's not Chinese. And yeah, and now I'm dating someone new, and he may or may not appear in the comic. Well, he's definitely already appeared under the guise of a raccoon, but we'll see if we do like a face reveal. Yeah, and so, and then my mom and dad have also featured in the comic a little bit, but mostly it's like it goes along with what story I want to tell at the time. So for my mama and baba, they were in the story review. I'm gonna like rework it a little bit, but they were in the story review that reviewed the vocabulary of like 你我 mama baba I, right, like 名字叫 stuff like that. And the narrative story review that I wrote basically kind of was a little vignette about us like moving to the States, and how like growing up, like baba mama like 从来没有说过我爱你, but like kind of sort of exploring all of the ways that they showed love that were not verbal, through the comic, and then kind of like ending on a note of like, yeah, like, you know, I love you too, right? And I think like that's one of the comics I'm happiest about, because I feel like it balanced the story that I wanted to tell, which was something I was also working through in my own mind, with also like a vocabulary review aspect. And so I think eventually the goal would be for me to be able to tell the stories that I think like are personally resonant for me, and hope that those are also meaningful and helpful to my readers, but also being able to have the language aspect to go with it. So I think like, and I need to cross this bridge when I come to it, for when the Chinese characters get to a point where the comics are almost all in Chinese. I have a feeling I might make two versions. So for Instagram, I'll make it bilingual, so that like people who can't read the characters can still get a sense of what the comic is like. But for the Panda Cub readers that like very much assume that you've been following the comics like linearly and learning the characters alongside each thing, that'll just be in Chinese.
It's great to know, and it's nice to see the progression and just what it could be for a lot of your readers, like the continuing of like just the story to be entertained and also like to learn more and more Chinese along the way. And I'm just wondering, like for you, why, or at this point, why is it still so important for you to teach your heritage language to people? Like, there's obviously different ways for you to use your art to make a living. You don't have to stick with having that language as a main component of your art. You can just create any sort of art. But why are you holding on to I'm gonna teach my heritage language when you can take an easier road and, to be honest, could potentially make a better like living out of just doing the traditional things, like maybe just making English like children's literature or something like that. So I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I think part of it is I enjoy it, but it's also something I don't see available, right? So if like a ton of people are already doing this, I probably wouldn't be working as hard. And in a way, it's also tough because I don't have any references to really work from. But I think like for me, it's so I mean, I'm 31 now, and I've I think like been pretty successful in relearning Chinese. So I can read quite fluently now. I can write, and like if I get stuck, I'll like pop into Pleco or something or Google Translate to just like check right what I've written. And I was like, is this right? But for me, I've kind of gotten to the level that works for me. I can definitely get a lot better at Chinese. I can't very easily, right? Like read internet novels without also having to have an electronic reference. But for me, that's okay, because what I really want with my language is to be able to communicate very fluently with my own family, both verbally, but also like on WeChat. And then also be able to like skim and read the hundreds of WeChat articles that like my older family members send to our family group and be able to participate in conversations. I mean, like one of the original reasons why I was really keen on getting better at Chinese was reconnecting with my grandparents. And that has definitely like been something that has happened, but I guess like unfortunately not as much as I would have liked. So my last grandparent, so I call him my yeye. He's actually my waigong, my mother's father. He passed away April 2020. And I think that was a bit tough because I thought like I would get to see him again, right? Like especially after committing to this as my career path. But like with COVID and stuff, like there was just no way that we were able to go back to China. And so I think for me, it's like I see these comics as a cultural bridge. And even though like, there are things that like, like that bridge is no longer going to directly lead to my yeye. And so when my ex-boyfriend and I split, and we were together for a long time, and we still like love and respect each other very much, but for a number of reasons, the relationship ended. But I am very grateful that the comics provided kind of a conversational platform for him understanding more about my culture. And it was actually interesting because he is a sixth grade teacher and he's used some of my comics about Chinese festivals actually in his class because he teaches world history. So, and I think like kind of knowing that these comics served as a bridge for me in these ways. And also, like, I've gotten a lot of really lovely messages from my readers about how, like, so one woman was like, I am half Chinese. My mother never spoke to me growing up, but your comics really encourage and inspire me to continue learning. And yeah, and I think like that is the most I can ask for. Like, even if at the end of the day, like my comics, don't end up being a complete curriculum that teaches like everything there is to know about Chinese, which I mean, like, is very likely that will not happen because there's so much stuff. But I think like as long as like they're a thread that people can come back to, or a bridge that people can like walk across together, that is very much something that is incredibly important to me. And like when I do have kids, I am hoping that like this will be something that we can read together, and that they will actually like to read together. And then I will also make them learn about their parents and grandparents through the stories. So I should probably write more of those. That's okay. I have time. Don't have kids yet.
That's great. And I think what you're doing, what your purpose and just your goals are very much attainable and very no I respect it so much. Like, I think it's especially even harder for those that are from the diaspora who grew up in the West their whole life for most part, and working hard still to stay connected to their culture, and now even like trying to like make like a business out of it so that it provide like some social impact in a way that I don't think our parents would have expected to happen. Like, a lot of times, like, oh, preserving your own culture, that's not in their kind of mind, like as much as they want that, but they wouldn't think, oh, it's gonna be their children's kind of main career path, that they used it to make money, like using their own culture to make money. That's unheard of. Like, for them, it's like, you're only going to make money from being a doctor or being a lawyer or like some sort of kind of mainstream career path. But for you to be using your art, your knowledge, and just the whole like entrepreneurial path to make a living, I think they would have never expected it, regardless how much they know like you're artistic, you're creative and such, because it's such a new career path as well. I would say like what you're doing, like using social media to kind of help make it to where you are able to publish your own book or comics and do all these great things. So it's again, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. I think you serve a lot of good for those that are trying to learn their heritage language, and for those that are interested in the culture. And yeah, I'm excited to see what else you will be doing in the future. So can you let everyone know, what are your future plans? Like, I know you want to make the club diner even bigger. So can you just talk about everything that you have in mind that you can reveal right now?
Yeah. So my future plans are three, and it's basically what I've already talked about. So I actually took a pretty like solid break from drawing comics in July because I was so busy creating the Panda Cub Diner food course. And so for that, it's a 4-week program. So like the first week is kind of giving you the lowdown of what is Sichuan cuisine, what is mala, and then like giving you all of these like very mouth-watering food like videos of the top 10 Sichuan dishes to order and or make. And then the second 2 weeks are all about setting up your kitchen. So kind of like, what do you actually need to make Sichuan food? It's actually like you don't actually need to buy anything new. You can just use what's already in your kitchen. But like if you wanted to get a wok and a cleaver, this is like how you season it and kind of make it. Also, just this experience that's lovely as opposed to a chore, right? So I don't know if you watch Li Ziqi videos. She's also like a Sichuanese woman, but like gorgeous and ethereal, and makes a lot of these amazing farm to table food videos. So these videos are not that. I watch that for pleasure. And then for mine, they're very functional. So they're supposed to kind of like walk you through the process of setting up your own kitchen so that you don't have to do any work in terms of researching or trying to figure out how to do stuff. And then the last 2 weeks are all about cooking. So like we make 就是红油辣椒 chili oil together, and then I take my students through 1 week of making one Chinese dish each day, and then ending with like a dinner party where you can cook 6 dishes. And kind of like I've been testing this myself alongside my 15 students, who it's a really interesting breakdown of demographics actually, because I thought it was mostly going to be Chinese diaspora people who signed up, but while there are like a couple of them, they're just like so many different people from different. So I like, yeah, there's like 2 folks from the UK, like one person in Bali and one person in Perth, and several people spread across the US. So I am planning on finishing that and then launching that in early September. And kind of my business plan is to focus on that as income generation. So that's like the leg one of my business plan. Now I've kind of gone back to drawing comics like semi full time, and I'm actually publishing my second issue of the Panda Cub Reader, hopefully by Friday. And I'll kind of start consistently posting comics again this month. And then the third thing is I'm supporting my new partner. So he is also an artist. He's a filmmaker. So he just finished shooting his short film called The 44th Chamber of Shaolin. So Shaolin 44 房. Have you ever did you grow up watching like Zhou Xinci movies, like Stephen Chow movies?
Yeah.
So it's very much like that, but like set in Staten Island, and like in English. So John is also Chinese American, and we connect a lot in terms of, yeah, like in a way, our culture very much informs what we do as narrative storytellers. And I think like it's just a matter of like how it comes out. So he's like putting together his rough edit and premiering probably next month. So I will be there cheerleading him on. I might share some of it on my Instagram as well.
That's amazing, and I'm so excited for what's ahead of you, and I can see it being very, very successful. And we definitely need this for the diaspora community, especially Chinese Americans that want to learn Mandarin Chinese and just pursue their like cultural learning that they might not be able to get just because of where they're living. Maybe they're in a place where it's very dominantly white and they are the only Asians. So it's nice to have the resources that you're providing for people to learn their language and their culture. And for those that want to see more of what you do and learn more about you and your story and just learn the language, learn the culture and all that stuff, where could they find you?
Yeah, so my main social is Instagram, and I am very active on it. Sometimes I'll like hide for 2 or 3 days if I need a mental health break, but I'm very active on it. And I love talking to readers in the comments and on DMs. So that's just Panda Cub Stories. That's my handle. And that's also my website. So pandacubstories.com.
Yeah, and people definitely check it out if you want more of her story in like comic form. Very cute, very digestible, very easy to like just get into it and just start learning the language. Like if you're not thinking of taking it seriously, still read it, have a look through, because it's very entertaining as well, very cute. So and if you're not really looking to learn it, if you want to see it, you can just go to her Instagram. She will have lots of like other pictures along the way that could get you like inspired or just start your journey. And on that note, thank you for listening, for the viewers or listeners as well. And if you want to keep supporting this podcast, again, subscribe to the podcast on your streaming platform. Share this with your friends and family that you think will enjoy Linda's story, and follow the Instagram at What Kind of Asian Pod, and keep listening for future episodes. And this is the end of our episode. We'll see you again next week. Bye bye.